we all have our conscious bias. When I actually deliver training, I'll say, okay, what are your conscious bias, and get that out first, and I will share mine as well. So, what have you got? Because people are they're more willing then to talk about to probably address unconscious. So we all know that every single one of us has biases, okay? Then we'll talk about unconscious bias, says it what it is in the tin, lacks awareness, you've got a preference or inclination that, inhibits your impartiality. So a lot of people don't even realise they have these unconscious bias. And Bina Candona was one of the first guys, to talk about unconscious bias when he came, in the UK, and he, realised that he was even doing it himself. He realised that, for example, and we'll talk about this a little bit later about, he's of Asian origin, and he realised when he was going to meetings and going to events, he would sit next to that person who's of the same ethnicity as him, and didn't realise he was doing it. It was like, oh my God, we're all doing it, because it's all about our background and experience. And, it's something that we don't realise we act upon, and so this is why I personally think it's really important to address and talk about bias, because there are still those people, like you said in your training, the people go, I haven't got any, I don't know what you're talking about. So sometimes, when they're actually talking about unconscious, they might actually realise, oh yeah, because it's not in their conscious, something that they've not really realised, and it does influence, I think we've all said in this first hour, it influences all of our decision making. Okay, the decisions we make, it influences them. When somebody walks in a room, we know that they've actually judged us, our ethnicity, age, size, whatever it is, and talking about the whole wider diversity, not just protected characteristics. We know that people judge that whole couple of minutes rule, second rule, to exactly when you've gone into an interview, somebody's made that decision on, are they sort of warm? But what I often talk about is that we've also got the power to overcome them. It's not something we can't overcome. If we talk about Brexit, dare I say it, how much racism and how much discrimination that is generally brought around, and people think it's more acceptable to be biased because of how the campaign and the propaganda around that. So it just shows you how it's exacerbated if it's raised to the fore and not done and dealt with appropriately. And those of you who deliver this training, I'm sure probably know about Kahneman and fast and slow thinking. And he sort of explained cognitive bias by, we have two systems in the brain. So we have our system one, which are the fast thinking, intuition, hunch, or automatic pilot, which we pretty much use most of the time. That's what we just do generally. How many people have driven some way, like, what am I doing this way? I've gone this way. It's our automatic reactions, where our system two is our more slow thinking, where it's rational, mindfulness, introspective, slower cognitive process. And we should really use more of our slow thinking, and we don't. We should make sure in all our processes, but that particularly, that we use slow thinking. That whole decision you've made at the beginning should not be happening, that whole perception of that person. So we should be using more and more of that slow thinking. And also, you could have a whole list of cognitive bias. This is just a little snapshot of what cognitive biases that we have. And one is called anchoring, where you literally rely on too much information of one trait of business. You're not looking at anything else, you've just picked on that one piece of information, and that's what you're going to go with, and your decisions are going to be based on that. You could begin some really insightful new piece of information, you're not even bothering to look at that. You're looking at that, and that is the anchor bias. Bandwagon says what is on the tin, get on the bandwagon. Also what you talked about earlier about groupthink, that whole groupthink where you are recruiting mini-me's, you go into an organisation and they all are of a certain age or maybe a certain ethnicity. It means that results in groupthink, where a lot of people are thinking the same. The more diversity you have within an organisation, the more diverse people, the more creative, the more productive, etc., etc. So it is really important. Basically, we just need something about it and sort out this bias, because it definitely has a positive impact. Like bias blind spot, the tendency to see yourself, I'm not biased. It's them. We have those blind spots, and you can't see it. You can see it in others, but you can't see it in yourself. And then you obviously got confirmation bias, interpret and look at. You're looking for somebody to confirm your ideas. So it's somebody that might be actually, for example, around your disability training, you might go, well, actually, disabled people can't match the job, and they're not really good at whether it might be how they write something, how they carry out people, and you're looking out for that. You're actually looking out for that. So another group of people who looked at this was Saput and Lieberman, very similar to Kahneman, and they talked about it being in two minds. So you've got your control processing, which is the conscious, explicit, and more the slow. And then automatic again, that whole quick about, you know, that quick sort of thinking. And you've probably seen those programs where you have those psychologists, and they're like, what's the first word, the first thing that you think of when you say that word? And that is your unconscious. That's what's coming up. That's what really is on your mind. Because when you've got time to think about it, you know what I mean? It doesn't give you that opportunity, but that's what that whole unconscious bias is about. And just for yourselves, really, to think about, nobody's got to speak out, and I've got to say something about, sometimes I do this to people. I might start with a lower level, like, I don't know, about other issues, but then I'll go, right, think of these people. So just think in your head, you know, black young man, teenage mother, asylum seeker, disabled person, homeless man, gay man, alcoholic dependent or drug user, Oxford graduate, banker and Muslim. Now, I'm sure we all thought wonderful positive thoughts about all those people, didn't we? You know, black young man, do we think of the hoodie on the street? Or do we think, well, actually, there's more, you know, this whole thing about, was it Cambridge or Oxford University trying to engage, get more, but no, often we're thinking of the hoodie. Unfortunately, people are thinking often of negative perceptions, and why is that? Is that because of, you know, our background experience? Is this because the media propaganda? Teenage mother, asylum seeker, the asylum, you know, often seen as asylum seeking refugees are another community that really face a lot of discrimination. So you talked about this, didn't you? About the implicit association test. And again, this was developed by Harvard. And what sometimes I will say to people who will have a go at this, but I honestly do feel, I say to people, you know, I'll put a warning sign on this, because I think, yes, it's a good exercise to assess, you know, or how are you thinking about different communities. So if you do get a chance, it is worth doing it. But I always say warning sign, because it doesn't mean if you come out, I'm a racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever it may be. Because at the end of the day, it's a test. There's some are going to be fallible. It just gives you, and even as a person who delivers training, it makes you think. It just makes you think, oh, have I? Because a lot of time we don't sit back and think about how we see other people. And this is why I do think that bias training, conscious and unconscious bias, is relevant.
The origin of bias is safety.
Yeah.
And we all have to have a certain degree of bias that sets off a warning signal.
Yeah.
That says this is potentially dangerous.
Yes.
For us to engage in.
Yeah. No, I think what she was saying is it should be dealt with and managed by organisations, whether it's by unconscious or conscious, not conscious, not where it's come from, but the whole, you should be dealing with both in that sort of sense. Binnick and Dola talks about micro behaviours as well. So it links into, it's not just about, you know, our unconscious bias, are our behaviours, you know, in little micro behaviours. You probably don't even think you're doing it, but have I got my back to you, you know, or am I sort of engaging with only certain people? And that can be really impactful, particularly in the workplace. You imagine that whole micro behaviours, and I think that's really important to address that as well. So we'll talk about that later. And that really links into those in and out groups. This is what I was saying about Binnick and Dola said, you know, he would go and sit next to that person he felt more comfortable with. And, you know, also when I delivered this, people will say, you know, I'd only seen like images of black people on TV, so I thought that's what they were all like. I'd only seen gay people, and that, you know, because if you've got to understand, you know, what, you know, you might have had someone from quite a rural area. It's not their fault that they've not engaged or met people from different communities. That's where they were born. You can't blame them. All you need to do is to engage with people and get them to find out more and get them to engage with different people. It's not their fault, and I think that's what we also have to address. And don't blame people. You can't blame where you were born and what your background was. You know, shared interests and hobbies, similar lifestyle, physical characteristics, similar background. You know, all those things I've talked about already. Body language, who we sit next to. You know, who we focus our attention on. That's the whole issue around the whole development, the lack of development of certain communities. There's probably a lack of attention being, you know, brought upon them. Why it's the same people rising to the top each time? It can't be all, you know, because they're better than everybody else, because we know that's not the case. Diversity, race in the workplace, whatever it is, it is much better to have those positive discussions that people don't feel they can't say certain words or have certain discussions. The more you talk about it, the more you have open discussions about all aspects of diversity inclusion, it is for the better. So, you know, I was thinking, maybe you could have some sort of open discussion and forum with when this said person is around, you know, because people sort of, like I say, it definitely came from like a fear thing. If it's commonplace to talk about race, talk about LGBT, talk about LGBT, talk about trans, then it's part of embedded in the fabric. So it's really important. There's lots of research that says, talk about it. You know, you could even go back and went, oh, I went to this really interesting session yesterday, and it made me think. You know, having those discussions, go back and take it somewhere and do something with it. Self-awareness, you know, be aware about, you know, our own self-awareness, you know, those sort of, not those little blind spots we talked about earlier. And funnily enough, when you were talking about challenging it, and it's an old sort of tongue twister, but use non-verbal communication for managing difficult conversations. And this is how you could use this lovely lady. In terms, you know, it's about what you said as well about depersonalise it, observation, you know, say what you was done without judgment. You know, the conversation we had that time, and you mentioned that. You know, it really made me feel uncomfortable that you could equate that you're, you know, being a white woman is similar to having that black experience. Perhaps next time you need to consider, you know, and it's just a way of managing those difficult conversations and those challenges, but doing it in a positive and a more, you know, because some people, they'll go on a diversity course and an inclusion course or a bias course, and they'll be like, you can't say that, you can't do. Don't do that. Don't do that. You've come from those different experiences and skills where you know you're not used to that, so the intent might come from, you know, not a bad place. Don't get me wrong, there are people that come from a bad place, but it might not come from a place. So it's how they've come to that decision, and by you actually trying to explain to them in a positive way, non-aggressive. It's much better for a better workplace. And people go to the other end of it sometimes and don't actually try and manage it, and that person could really be supported and dealt with to actually come, you know, have a better understanding, rather than, you know, saying I'm not allowing them to be like with a volunteer, I'm not allowing them to be, you know, or whatever. So it can be managed. It can be managed, in a more effective way. Personal networks, you know, are they inclusive? Are they exclusive? Assess that. You know, challenge your own decision making. Are you making a lot of quick decisions or slow? Are you using your slow thinking or your fast thinking? You know, challenge your own decisions when you've made a decision. Could you have done that differently if you were a lot more slow in your thinking? Small acts of kindness. This is around, you know, if you have acknowledged you might have done your IAT, your implicit association test, and realise that, oh, maybe I have got a bias towards that community. Is there anything you can do to address that? How can you sort of show those small acts of kindness to engage with somebody from that community, to find out a little bit more about them, try and get those barriers down? You know, do those small, you know, do you realise when you're going out to lunch, you always invite the same people? Why are you not inviting that person? When you're making a cup of tea, are you avoiding that? You know, all those sort of things to sort of bring them in and sort of challenge your thinking and challenge those ideas. You know, be aware of the stereotype threat we talked about earlier. So we've already started talking about discussions already. You've already said, Yvette, that you think it's something you could probably add on and include. What do other people think about both? So we've sort of said, I think, have we all agreed that we all think bias to still definitely be addressed and delivered? Yes, so great, we're on the same way.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important, and also it is relevant as part of, and that's what I think is really important, as part of the agenda, not just bias training. Embedding diversity inclusion takes years. This was, fortunately, Gabriella, who was going to be with me, pretend she's here. You got me in. We had a discussion. She was going to talk about this today about some work they did in Imperial College London, and they were, you know, oh, we're going to do this. It was mainly for like recruiting managers. This is great. We're going to implement this training on conscious bias, and she felt that it didn't have that much of an impact. People did the course, and this is what we need to do. What we're doing after the course, what's happening in terms of making sure they've understood, they've learned, they're implementing, they're adapting. And she said that people, you know, she believed that we've sort of talked all the way through what's happening next, not just around let's just put this course on, because she saw it herself. She implemented the course, but she found that people were still having their biases and not always thinking about it. You know, what could be done throughout the recruitment process? I mean, I've even talked about some people saying, do we have a question in there? You know, a trigger, a reminder of when we're doing training, you know, as part of that process for every recruitment cycle, could we have a little reminder in, you know, bias, remember, you know, something, because people do a course and off they pop and they don't do it again. And she found that, you know, it was really excellent. They did it at the time, they thought, yeah, you know, this is important, but there was no follow-up. There was nothing done. Obviously, she was in charge of the learning aspect, but she's not the whole strategy. She's not looking at implementation. She's not looking at ongoing learning and development. So it was something that, you know, that whole isolation piece. So it's really about, you know, making sure that it's not just a one-off. It's not just in isolation, which, as we've talked about already, people have made that mistake. Something a lot of organisations do, they do one training, you've not had a training for the last 5 years. Somebody could be there for 10 years and that's it. Oh, I've done my unconscious bias training. When was that? 2008. Do you know what I mean? So that happens a lot, doesn't it? Like, nothing. And I was having this argument recently with an organisation myself, like, no. So people could have been here for like, what are you doing now? It's the whole continuous learning process. What's being made available? It doesn't always have to be, you know, a learning of 3 hours. It could be like, you know, tools. I'm actually working in an organisation, giving them tools and resources to use in their staff teams.
I think it's trying to understand the organisation's culture to see where you can make a difference.
Yes.
And even if it's that small, it's a step in the right direction as long as there's many of these other things. But as I say, this one organisation, really, really lucky because they report back on all the issues that we raise at the training. It goes into their equality and diversity steering group, which goes to the management team.
Exactly, yeah.
And we actually look at some of their policies, and so it is that ongoing. But it's all due to these new people that are enthusiastic, and like, let's keep them enthusiastic. Staff survey comes back really positive.
Yeah, and that's good. It's like all those things, like the stuff in. What else are you doing? You know, when you I think, oh yeah, it's on there monitoring of you. Things like, what are you monitoring? You're getting feedback, and when you're doing the staff engagement, are you looking who's engaged in the organisation? And you're breaking it down into text characteristics. Is it showing you anything? You know, there's lots of ways to identify if bias is in place, and you know, is it being managed? You know, the staff engagement most service might ask a question. You know, have you witnessed discrimination? Have you been individual? You know, do you think the organisation addresses diversity and inclusion? You know, that sort of thing. At least it gives you a way, rather than okay, we've done it and everything's fine. We haven't got any problems here. You know, it might be a case of we've got a culture, people don't speak up. Do you actually make it clear that people can speak up? You know, what do you do about campaigning and let people know? Well, actually, if you're been a victim of discrimination or bias, do you know where to go? Do you know what to do? Often people don't know. So I think if you're not raising those issues about zero tolerance, for example, how do they know what to do about it? And that's another problem. So it's, as we've talked about, you know, it's a whole process. You know, is there any action planning? You don't always have to have a diversity strategy. You know, you can build it into your organisational strategy, but as long as you're demonstrating there's something there that you are addressing it with, you know, random sampling. You know, one thing about interviews, you know, are people doing, those people who do interviews, are they doing it right? Are they bringing those biases in? Do we random sampling? You know, you could say, let's have a look at the notes, let's see. Because I've heard that, you know, I've seen some people write notes, and they're being quite personal, and you have to be quite clear in how people are conducting those interviews. No bias should come into play. But we've all had those, well, I've had experience over the years where people have put personal opinion, like, what the hell are you writing that for? You know, you think, oh my God, what is happening out there? We're assuming, you know, and I've been in that position, yeah, we've got really good policy, but what are people doing out there when they're implementing it? How are we monitoring it? How are we gauging that? Okay, so the other things we can talk about, you know, in terms of, you know, getting feedback from people. You know, whether it's, as well as your staff engagement survey, do you give opportunities to people to actually give you that feedback where you could have told on your honourable lady that the fact that, you know, this horrible boss, that you know it wasn't appropriate. You know, some people have anonymous ways of, you know, sharing information, you know, but other things, you've got your network groups, for example, that some people find really effective. You know, what other ways are you challenging and getting those ideas back to actually say, is bias taking place, rather than, you know, even when I was here, yeah, it's all right, but what are you doing to actually test what I'm telling you, you know? Understand it takes time, like I've said, you know, ensure any trying is delivered appropriately, because I think right at the beginning, I think, where there was one case where they said that it was actually made bias worse in that situation. I mean, it's a very one case I've only heard of. And also, you know, make sure, I've also said again, repeating this, if we've gone through it really well the whole way through, you know, do you know, when someone comes to an organisation, do they know it's a no zero tolerance in terms of any sort of discriminatory behaviour? So, you know, I think we sort of are on the same wavelength here. I think we're all sort of saying, yes, it's good, yes, it should continue, but look at other aspects of the whole picture, the whole, you know, aspects of the workplace, and that really how it can be addressed there. Look at the gaps, look at what you're doing. And I think that would be the way forward, rather than those silly organisations who just decide, well, this is it, I'm going to do that, and it's a standalone.